At dinner, my son told me to clean the toilet in front of his wealthy friends. I sat there in stunned silence, but what I did next left them all speechless. I'm grateful you're here. Follow my story to the end and comment which state you're watching from so I can see how far this reaches. I never imagined that at 70 years old, my own child would make me feel smaller than an ant. Standing in Benjamin's gleaming kitchen in his Newport Beach mansion that evening, watching him prepare for what he called the most important dinner of his business career, I thought I was there to support my son's success. How naive I was. My name is Eleanor Blackwood, and I've lived through more than my share of hardships. Born in 1953 in the small farming town of Millbrook, Colorado, I learned early that life doesn't hand you anything on a silver platter. I worked as a nurse for 43 years, caring for others, putting everyone else's needs before my own. I raised Benjamin as a single mother after his father, Robert, walked out when Benjamin was only 12. I worked double shifts at Millbrook General Hospital, sold homemade pies on weekends, and took in sewing just to keep us afloat. When Benjamin got accepted to Stanford on a partial scholarship, I took out a second mortgage on our tiny two-bedroom house to cover the remaining costs. When he wanted to start his tech company, I cashed in my retirement savings to give him the seed money. I believed in my son's dreams even when the bank wouldn't. Benjamin had built Zenith Technologies from nothing into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His artificial intelligence software was revolutionizing healthcare systems across the country. He lived in a modernist glass mansion overlooking the Pacific, drove a collection of luxury cars that belonged in a museum, and flew first class to technology conferences in Tokyo and London. At 47, he'd achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of, and more. The irony was that while I'd sacrificed everything to launch his success, Benjamin had gradually pushed me out of his life. After Robert died in a car accident 3 years ago, yes, the same man who'd abandoned us had somehow wormed his way back into Benjamin's life during his college years, my son had become increasingly distant. Our weekly phone calls became monthly, then quarterly. Invitations to family holidays dried up. I'd become an inconvenience in his carefully curated world of venture capitalists and tech moguls. What Benjamin didn't know was that his elderly mother, Eleanor Blackwood, had her own secret, a secret so enormous it could change everything. 4 weeks earlier, I'd been standing in line at Peterson's General Store in Millbrook buying my usual weekly lottery ticket. The same numbers I'd played religiously for 18 years. Robert's birthday, Benjamin's birthday, the date I graduated nursing school, the day I bought our first house, and the date Benjamin started his company. Numbers that represented every milestone in a life built around family and sacrifice. When old Frank Peterson handed me that ticket with his usual weathered smile and said, "Maybe this is your lucky week, Mrs. Blackwood," I chuckled like I always did. After Robert's funeral, those $2 tickets had become my small act of hope in a world that seemed determined to make elderly women invisible. The drawing was on a Tuesday night. I was sitting in my small apartment. I had to sell the house 2 years ago when property taxes became impassable on my Social Security, watching my usual shows and eating a dinner of soup and crackers. I almost didn't check the numbers, almost threw the ticket away like I had hundreds of times before. But something made me pick up my reading glasses and compare those numbers on the screen to the ones on my crumpled ticket. I'd won $347 million. $347 million, the largest jackpot in Colorado state history. I stared at that ticket for nearly an hour, checking and rechecking the numbers until my eyes burned. When the reality finally sunk in, I didn't scream or dance or call anyone. I sat in my threadbare recliner and cried. Not tears of joy, but tears of a complex mixture of emotions I couldn't untangle. Relief, disbelief, and underneath it all, a deep sadness that I had no one to share this moment with. I'd kept the secret for 4 weeks now. I'd quietly hired a lawyer in Denver, set up the trust structures, arranged for the lump sum payout, and completed all the legal requirements. The money was sitting in my accounts, earning more in daily interest than most people made in a year. But I hadn't told a soul. Not my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd helped me with groceries when my arthritis flared up. Not my sister Dorothy in Phoenix, who called every Sunday to check on me. And certainly not Benjamin, who had become so successful that he'd forgotten where he came from. When Benjamin called me 3 days ago, the first time he'd initiated contact in 4 months, and invited me to his house for dinner, my heart had leapt with hope. Maybe he was finally ready to rebuild our relationship. Maybe success had matured him enough to remember that his mother existed. He's having some important business associates over, he'd said in that clipped professional tone he used to everyone now. You know, it would be helpful if you could cook dinner, give it that authentic family touch that investors like to see. I should have recognized the warning signs in his phrasing. Not, I'd love to see you, or I miss you, Mom. Just that I could be helpful, that I could provide a service. But I was so grateful for any invitation into his life that I said yes immediately.
Now standing in his pristine kitchen that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries, I was beginning to understand what kind of help he actually wanted. "Mom, make sure you stay completely in the background tonight," Benjamin said without looking at me, adjusting his $800 Hermes tie for the fourth time in 10 minutes. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his custom suit impeccable, his Swiss watch gleaming under the kitchen's designer lighting. These investors are worth billions collectively. I need everything to be absolutely flawless. I nodded, smoothing my simple black dress, the nicest thing in my closet, purchased from a department store clearance rack 2 years ago. My hands weren't shaking from age, but from the nervous energy that had been building since I had arrived at his house that afternoon. For the first time in nearly 2 years, I was inside my son's home, surrounded by luxury that still took my breath away. The house was a masterpiece of modern architecture. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. The kitchen featured Italian marble countertops, professional-grade appliances, and a wine refrigerator stocked with bottles that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Everything was white, chrome, and spotless, an environment that felt more like a high-end gallery than a home. Benjamin had shown me around earlier with the detached pride of someone giving a museum tour. "The smart home system controls everything," he had explained, demonstrating how his voice could adjust the lighting, temperature, and even the window opacity. Every piece of technology in this house showcases what Zenith can do for residential clients. I'd murmured appropriate praise while privately thinking the house felt cold and sterile. Where were the family photos? The comfortable reading chairs? The lived-in spaces that made a house feel like a home? Everything looked like it had been arranged for a magazine shoot. "The guests tonight are crucial," Benjamin continued, pacing the kitchen with nervous energy I hadn't seen since his college days. "Victoria Sterling from Sterling Ventures, David Chen from Pacific Capital, and Alexandra Petrov from Moscow Innovation Fund. Together, they could provide the $200 million in Series C funding that Zenith needs to expand globally." $200 million. The amount rolled off his tongue casually, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. This dinner mattered more than he was letting on. "What would you like me to prepare?" I asked, rolling up my sleeves. I'd been cooking since I was 12 years old, helping my mother feed our family of 6 on a farm worker's budget. 40 years of nursing shifts had taught me to create delicious meals quickly and efficiently. My feet ached in my sensible shoes, my arthritis protested as I rolled pastry and stirred sauces, but I poured decades of experience into creating a meal worthy of his important guests. Benjamin checked on my progress periodically, offering suggestions with the tone of someone managing a catering service rather than speaking to his mother. "Make sure the presentation is restaurant quality," he said, watching me plate the appetizers. "These people notice details. The wine pairings need to be perfect. I've selected bottles from my collection. Don't pour too generously. Remember, you're here to serve, not to participate in the conversation. These are complex business discussions."
Each instruction felt like a small cut, but I told myself he was just nervous. This dinner could secure his company's future. Of course he wanted everything perfect. The doorbell chimed at exactly 7:30. Benjamin didn't believe in being fashionably late when hundreds of millions of dollars were on the table. "Answer that, Mom," he said, straightening his already perfect collar one final time. "And remember, you're here to facilitate, not to be noticed. Professional service, invisible presence." I walked to the massive front door, my heart hammering with an anxiety I couldn't quite name. Through the glass panels, I could see three figures who looked like they'd stepped off the cover of Fortune magazine. Victoria Sterling stood in the center, a woman in her early 50s with silver hair swept into a perfect chignon and wearing a white power suit that probably cost more than my car. Her presence commanded attention even through a closed door. To her left was David Chen, a venture capital legend whose deals had created some of Silicon Valley's biggest success stories. His reputation was built on making billion-dollar bets that seemed impossible until they paid off spectacularly. On the right stood Alexandra Petrov, the Russian-born billionaire whose investment fund had launched dozens of unicorn startups. She was younger than the others, maybe mid-40s, with the kind of confidence that came from turning every investment into gold. I opened the door with what I hoped was an appropriate smile. "Good evening," I said quietly. "Please come in. Benjamin is waiting for you." They moved past me like I was part of the architecture. Useful, necessary, but not worthy of acknowledgement. Victoria's diamond earrings caught the light from Benjamin's modern chandelier as she surveyed the living room with the calculating gaze of someone who evaluated million-dollar opportunities before her morning coffee.
"Benjamin!" Victoria's voice carried the warmth reserved for potentially profitable relationships. "This space is absolutely stunning." My son appeared instantly, his business smile blazing with practiced charm. "Victoria, David, Alexandra, welcome to my home. I'm thrilled you could make it." "Impressive setup," David said, admiring the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the ocean view. "The integration of smart home technology is seamless. Is this all Zenith's work?" "Every system in this house runs through our residential AI platform," Benjamin replied with obvious pride. "From climate control to security, entertainment systems to kitchen appliances. It's a living demonstration of what we can offer high-end clients." Alexandra walked to the windows, gazing out at the Pacific. "The view alone must be worth millions. You've done well for yourself, Benjamin." "Location was crucial," he said, guiding them toward the living area. "Newport Beach attracts exactly the demographic that Zenith targets, affluent professionals who value cutting-edge technology and seamless integration." I quietly retreated to the kitchen to begin final preparations for dinner. As I arranged canapés on crystal plates that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, I could hear their conversation flowing toward business topics. The smart home market is projected to reach $180 billion by 2025. Zenith's AI-driven approach positions us to capture significant market share across multiple segments. The projections are certainly compelling, but we need to discuss scalability challenges and competitive differentiation. I carried the first course into the dining room, where Benjamin had set a table that looked like something from a luxury hotel. Crystal glasses caught the light from a modern chandelier, while fresh orchids provided elegant centerpieces. Everything was calculated to impress. As I served the lobster bisque, the conversation continued around me as if I were invisible. Our proprietary machine learning algorithms give us a substantial moat. The system learns user preferences and anticipates needs in ways that traditional smart home platforms can't match. "Interesting," David mused, tasting the soup. "This is excellent, by the way, but tell us about customer acquisition costs and lifetime value metrics." I refilled water glasses and cleared the soup bowls. While they discussed market penetration strategies and revenue projections, the numbers being thrown around were staggering. Millions and millions of dollars discussed as casually as most people talk about grocery shopping. The main course, my carefully prepared beef Wellington, was met with genuine appreciation. "This is restaurant quality," Alexandra said, cutting into the perfectly pink beef wrapped in golden pastry. "Where did you find your chef?" Benjamin's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it.
I have my sources for exceptional service, he said smoothly, not looking in my direction. My heart sank a little further. Not my mother prepared this, or even this is a family recipe, just his sources for service. As I served the final course, the conversation took a turn that made my blood run cold. Before we discuss specific investment terms, Victoria said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, we need to address some due diligence concerns that came up in our background research. Benjamin's confident expression flickered for a moment. Of course, I'm happy to address any questions. It's about personal financial management, David continued. Our research indicates some family financial obligations that could potentially impact your focus on the company. I froze in the doorway between kitchen and dining room, the coffee service tray suddenly feeling incredibly heavy in my hands. I appreciate your thoroughness, Benjamin said carefully, but I can assure you that my personal finances are completely separate from Zenith's operations. We're sure they are, Alexandra interjected, but successful entrepreneurs often face pressure from family members who don't understand the demands of building a unicorn company. How have you handled those dynamics? This was my moment to retreat to the kitchen, to give them privacy for their business discussion. But something in Benjamin's tone made me hesitate. Family management has actually been one of my key learning experiences, he said, his voice gaining confidence. Early in Zenith's development, I had to make some difficult decisions about resource allocation and emotional boundaries. Victoria leaned forward with obvious interest. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we like to see. Can you give us a specific example? Benjamin glanced toward the kitchen, then lowered his voice slightly, not enough that I couldn't hear, but enough to create the illusion of confidentiality. My mother, for instance. After my father died, she developed some unrealistic expectations about financial support. Elderly parents often struggle with the reality that their adult children have their own priorities and obligations. The coffee tray trembled in my hands. Smart boundaries, David nodded approvingly. Family sentiment can destroy a startup's cash flow if you're not careful. Exactly, Benjamin continued, warming to his theme. I learned early that successful entrepreneurs can't let emotional manipulation interfere with business decisions. My mother had to understand that her comfortable retirement wasn't my responsibility when I was building something this important.
The words hit me like physical blows. Comfortable retirement? I was living in a one-bedroom apartment, stretching Social Security checks to cover basic expenses. Emotional manipulation? I'd given him everything I had, including my retirement savings, to help launch his dreams. But he wasn't finished. The key, Benjamin said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing hard-won wisdom, is establishing clear boundaries early. Family members need to understand their role in supporting your success, not hindering it with unrealistic expectations. How did you handle the practical aspects? Alexandra asked. Elderly parents can be quite persistent when they feel entitled to their children's success. Benjamin's laugh was cold and calculating. You have to be firm but fair. I explained to her that while I appreciated her early support, I couldn't allow past sacrifices to become future obligations. She needed to understand that her job now was to be supportive, without being burdensome. I stood in that doorway, invisible and forgotten, listening to my son describe me like a business problem he'd successfully solved. The child I'd raised alone, the young man whose dreams I'd funded with everything I had, was sitting at his expensive table telling billionaires how he'd managed to neutralize his inconvenient mother. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that separates successful entrepreneurs from the rest, Victoria said, with obvious approval. Family complications have derailed more startups than market conditions ever could. Absolutely, Benjamin agreed. I tell other entrepreneurs all the time, you can't build an empire if you're constantly looking backward at people who want to anchor you to the past. The coffee service tray slipped from my numb fingers and crashed to the floor. The sound of shattering china and crystal echoed through Benjamin's pristine dining room like a gunshot. Hot coffee splashed across his polished hardwood floors, and fragments of his expensive Waterford crystal scattered like diamonds across the room. All conversations stopped. 4 pairs of eyes turned toward me, 3 curious, 1 furious. "Jesus Christ, Mom!" Benjamin exploded, his professional composure evaporating instantly. "Those glasses were part of a set that cost $8,000. I stood there, frozen, staring at the destruction at my feet. Coffee was soaking into the Persian rug that probably cost more than I'd made in a year of nursing. Crystal shards glittered in the chandelier light like accusations. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. Let me clean this up." "Don't touch anything else," Benjamin snapped, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. He turned to his guests with a forced laugh that didn't hide his mortification. "I apologize. This is exactly the kind of situation I was describing. Family complications that can derail important moments." Victoria Sterling's expression was a masterpiece of polite concern mixed with barely concealed amusement. "Perhaps we should move to the living room while this gets sorted out." "Of course," Benjamin said quickly, gesturing toward the other room. "Mom, just stay here and deal with this. Don't come out until it's cleaned up properly." They filed out of the dining room, their voices resuming in lower tones. I caught fragments of conversation that made my heart sink further. Exactly what we were discussing. Family management challenges. Potential operational disruptions. I knelt on the floor among the broken crystal, my arthritic knees protesting against the hardwood. As I carefully gathered the larger pieces, trying not to cut myself on the razor-sharp edges, I could hear Benjamin's voice from the living room, smooth and professional once again. "I apologize for the disruption. This actually illustrates perfectly why clear boundaries are so essential in business operations." My hands shook as I picked up fragment after fragment. Each piece of crystal seemed to reflect back the truth I'd been refusing to see. To my son, I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a liability, an embarrassment, a problem to be managed. The irony was devastating. Here I was, kneeling on his floor like a servant, while $347 million sat in my bank accounts. More money than he'd probably see in his lifetime, earned not through manipulation or abandoning family, but through pure chance and 18 years of hope. As I soaked up coffee with paper towels, my mind wandered to the conversation I'd had with my lawyer, Margaret Hendricks, just 3 days ago. She'd been handling the lottery paperwork and had insisted on meeting to discuss my options. "Eleanor," she said, sitting across from me in her Denver office, "you need to think carefully about how you want to handle this windfall. This kind of money changes everything. Your relationships, your security, your future." "I don't want it to change anything," I replied naively. "I just want to help my family, maybe travel a little, live comfortably." Margaret smiled sadly. "Honey, money this size changes things whether you want it to or not. People will treat you differently when they know. Some will become your best friends overnight. Others might feel entitled to your good fortune. You need to be very careful about who you tell and when." "But surely my own son—" "Especially your own son," Margaret interrupted gently. "Family money is the most complicated kind. He's successful in his own right, which could go either way. Either he'll be genuinely happy for you, or he'll feel threatened, diminished somehow. And based on what you've told me about your relationship lately," she'd trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Benjamin had been pulling away from me for years, embarrassed by my modest circumstances, uncomfortable with reminders of where he'd come from. How would he react to discovering that his supposedly poor mother was suddenly worth more than his entire company?
Now, kneeling in his dining room, cleaning up my own humiliation while he entertained billionaires in the next room, I was beginning to understand Margaret's warnings. I finished cleaning up the worst of the mess and stood slowly, my knees screaming in protest. Through the archway, I could see Benjamin gesturing animatedly as he spoke to his potential investors. He looked relaxed now, comfortable, back in his element, discussing market strategies and growth projections. The key differentiator, he was saying, is our predictive analytics engine. While competitors focus on reactive automation, Zenith anticipates user needs before they're even consciously aware of them. Impressive, David Chen replied. But what about data privacy concerns? European regulations are becoming increasingly stringent. We've built privacy protection into our core architecture, Benjamin responded confidently. GDPR compliance isn't an afterthought, it's fundamental to our design philosophy. I walked quietly to the kitchen, staying out of their sightline. On the counter sat the dessert I'd prepared, individual chocolate lava cakes with gold leaf garnish. Hours of work, each one perfectly crafted to impress his important guests. Should I serve dessert? The dinner had been interrupted by my clumsiness. Maybe the best thing I could do was disappear entirely, let him salvage the evening without further risk of embarrassment. But as I stood there debating, I heard Victoria Sterling's voice drifting from the living room. Benjamin, I have to ask, is this kind of family disruption something we need to factor into our investment decision? My blood ran cold. My accident was being discussed as a business risk. Not at all, Benjamin replied smoothly. This was actually perfect timing for demonstrating exactly how I handle unexpected complications. Clear protocols, swift resolution, minimal impact on core operations. Your mother seems quite elderly, Alexandra observed. Will she require increasing care and attention as time goes on? That could affect your availability for travel and long work hours. There was a pause that seemed to stretch forever. My mother has her own life and her own arrangements, Benjamin said carefully. I've made it clear that while I care about her well-being, I can't allow personal obligations to interfere with Zenith's growth trajectory. She understands that successful entrepreneurs have to make difficult prioritization decisions. I gripped the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles went white. My own arrangements? I lived alone in a tiny apartment, had no family besides him and my sister who lived across the country. What arrangements was he referring to? That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking we look for, Victoria said approvingly. Too many founders get bogged down in emotional complications that compromise their effectiveness. Family loyalty is admirable, David added, but business requires a different kind of loyalty. Loyalty to your vision, your team, your investors. Precisely, Benjamin agreed. I learned early that you can't build something transformative if you're constantly looking backward or managing other people's expectations about what you owe them. Other people's expectations. Is that what my sacrifices had become in his mind? Unreasonable expectations rather than investments in his future? I thought about the second mortgage I had taken on our house to help pay for his Stanford education, the retirement savings I had cashed in to give him seed money for Zenith, the countless nights I'd worked double shifts to keep us afloat after his father left, the years I'd gone without new clothes, without vacations, without any luxuries, so he could have every opportunity. Were those sacrifices now just other people's expectations? The chocolate lava cakes are ready, I called softly from the kitchen, not wanting to interrupt, but knowing they'd expect dessert. Bring them in, Mom, and be careful with the plates this time. The casual cruelty of the comment hit me like a slap. Be careful this time. As if I were a clumsy child who needed supervision rather than his mother who'd been serving elegant meals since before he was born.
I arranged the desserts on his best china plates, my hands steadier now, despite the storm raging in my heart. As I carried the tray into the living room, the conversation continued around me as if I were invisible. "These look incredible," Victoria said, accepting her dessert with the kind of polite smile you give good service staff. "Thank you." I nodded quietly and distributed the remaining plates, then retreated toward the kitchen. "Don't go far, Mom," he said without looking at me. "We'll need coffee shortly, and someone should start cleaning up the kitchen." Someone should start cleaning up. Not, "Could you please?" or "When you have a chance." Just, someone should. Like I was the help rather than the woman who had given birth to him. As I stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of the elaborate meal I'd prepared, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled my phone from my purse and scrolled through my contacts until I found Margaret Hendricks's number. She'd told me to call anytime, day or night, if I needed anything related to the lottery situation. "Margaret, it's Eleanor Blackwood. I know it's late, but I need to make some changes to my arrangements. Immediately." "Eleanor, are you all right? You sound upset." "I'm fine," I said, though my voice was shaking. "I need to set up some accounts and make some transfers. Tonight, if possible." "Of course. What's happened?" I looked through the archway at my son, still holding court with his potential investors, still discussing business strategies and growth projections while I cleaned up after him like hired help. "I've decided it's time to stop being invisible," I said quietly, "and I think I know exactly how to do it."
Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor, whatever you're planning, please think carefully. Money can be a powerful weapon, but it can also destroy relationships permanently." "The relationship was destroyed long before tonight," I replied, watching Benjamin laugh at something David Chan had said. "Tonight just made it official." As I hung up the phone, I realized that my life was about to change in ways I'd never imagined. But first, I had coffee to serve and a kitchen to clean. After all, someone had to do it. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, Benjamin Blackwood was going to learn that underestimating his mother was the biggest mistake he'd ever made. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, matching the weight in my chest. I'd barely slept, tossing and turning in Benjamin's sterile guest bedroom while replaying the evening's humiliation over and over. Every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every moment I'd been treated like hired help rather than his mother. But something had changed during those sleepless hours. The phone call to Margaret had set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. By sunrise, my lawyer had already begun implementing the financial arrangements I'd requested. The first phase of my plan was underway. I found Benjamin in his kitchen at 7 a.m., dressed in his usual expensive workout gear, preparing a protein smoothie while simultaneously checking emails on his phone. The scene of last night's disaster had been cleaned, probably by his regular housekeeping service, but the memory hung in the air like smoke. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said carefully, pouring myself coffee from the pot he had already made. He looked up briefly from his phone, his expression distant. "Morning, Mom. Thanks for handling dinner last night. Despite the incident, I think it went well overall." Despite the incident, as if my humiliation was just a minor technical glitch in his business presentation. "The investors seemed impressed with your company," I offered, sitting across from him at the marble kitchen island. "They were. Victoria Sterling called this morning. They're moving forward with preliminary term sheets." Benjamin's face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I remembered from his childhood. This could be the funding round that takes Zenith global. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old maternal pride. My son was brilliant, successful, achieving things I'd never dreamed possible. But then I remembered how he'd described me to those same investors, and the warmth died in my chest. "Benjamin, I wanted to talk to you about some things that were said last night." His fingers paused over his phone screen. "What about?" "When you were discussing family management with your investors, some of the things you said about me, they were hurtful." Benjamin set his phone down with obvious reluctance, as if I were interrupting something important. "Mom, what exactly are you referring to?"
You told them I had unrealistic expectations about financial support. You said I was trying to emotionally manipulate you. You made it sound like I was some kind of burden you'd successfully managed to shed. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Mom, I was speaking in general terms about entrepreneurial challenges. If you took it personally, that's not what I intended. You specifically mentioned my name. You talked about my comfortable retirement as if I was living in luxury instead of stretching Social Security checks to pay rent on a one-bedroom apartment. Mom, your living situation is your choice. You could have a larger place if you managed your finances better. I've offered to help you create a budget. You've offered to help me create a budget. The words came out sharper than I intended. Benjamin, I worked as a nurse for 43 years. I managed our household finances as a single mother after your father left. I think I understand budgeting. He picked up his phone again, clearly wanting to end this conversation. Look, I have a conference call in 20 minutes. Can we discuss this later? When later? You live 40 minutes away, and we talk maybe once a month. When exactly would we have this conversation? Benjamin's expression hardened. That's exactly the kind of guilt trip I was talking about last night. You're trying to make me feel bad for being successful, for having priorities beyond managing your feelings. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Managing my feelings, as if my hurt at being dismissed and humiliated was just emotional maintenance he shouldn't have to deal with. I'm not trying to guilt trip you. I'm trying to understand when my son started seeing his mother as a liability instead of the person who sacrificed everything to help him succeed. Sacrificed everything? Benjamin's voice rose slightly. Mom, you made choices. You chose to work those extra shifts. You chose to take out that second mortgage. You chose to give me your retirement savings. I never asked you to do any of that. I stared at him. This man, you looked like my son but spoke like a stranger. You never asked? Benjamin, you were 18 years old with dreams of Stanford and starting a tech company. Of course you didn't. You were a child with big dreams. I was your mother. Supporting those dreams was what mothers do. And I appreciate that support, but appreciation doesn't create lifelong financial obligations. He stood up, clearly done with the conversation. I have to get ready for my call. Sit down, I said firmly, using the voice that had gotten him to do his homework and clean his room for 18 years.
Actually, we are finished. I have a business to run, Mom. I can't spend my morning rehashing decisions that were made decades ago. He started toward the door, then paused and turned back to me. And Mom, last night's dinner was important. More important than you seem to understand. These investors could change everything for Zenith. I need to know that if we do this again, you can handle yourself appropriately without causing disruptions. The words hit me like a physical blow. Handle myself appropriately? Causing disruptions? As if accidentally dropping a tray made me unfit for civilized company. What exactly are you saying, Benjamin? I'm saying that if we're going to maintain a relationship, there need to be some boundaries, clear expectations about behavior and conduct, especially around important business associates. Boundaries like what? Benjamin's phone buzzed with what was probably his conference call, but he ignored it for the moment. Like understanding that when I'm entertaining investors or clients, your role is to be helpful and invisible. No personal conversations, no family drama, no accidents that create uncomfortable situations. Helpful and invisible, I repeated slowly. Like hired help. Like family members who understand that successful people have professional obligations that take priority over personal comfort. I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was an ultimatum. Submit to being treated as his personal servant or be cut out of his life entirely. And if I don't agree to these boundaries? Benjamin shrugged, checking his phone again. Then maybe it's better if we limit our interactions to holidays and special occasions, less opportunity for misunderstandings. The dismissal was complete and brutal. 47 years of being his mother, reduced to holiday visits if I refused to accept second-class status in his life. I see, I said quietly. So those are my choices? Be your unpaid household staff or be gradually erased from your life? Don't be so dramatic, Mom. I'm asking you to be considerate of my professional responsibilities. Is that really so unreasonable? At that moment, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and his face immediately brightened. "This is the call I've been waiting for," he said, already mentally dismissing me. "We'll continue this conversation later." But as he answered the phone with his practiced business voice, "Victoria, perfect timing. I've been reviewing the term sheets," I realized there was nothing left to continue. The conversation was over, and so was our relationship as I'd known it. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 70 years, and walked upstairs to gather my overnight bag. Behind me, I could hear Benjamin's voice animated with excitement as he discussed valuations and equity structures with his potential investor. As I packed my few belongings in his pristine guest room, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. I looked old, tired, defeated. But underneath that reflection, I could see something else stirring, something that hadn't been there yesterday. Anger. Not the hot, explosive anger of a moment's frustration, but the cold, calculating anger of someone who had finally seen the truth and was ready to act on it. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Hendricks. "Phase 1 complete. Accounts established. Awaiting your instructions for Phase 2. I typed back, "Proceed with Phase 2. All of it." By the time I reached my car, Benjamin was still on his call, pacing his living room while gesturing enthusiastically. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see him in his element, successful, confident, completely absorbed in building his empire. He never looked outside to see his mother driving away. The 40-minute drive back to Millbrook gave me time to think, to plan, to prepare for what was coming next. Because Margaret had been right about one thing. Money this size changed everything. And it was about to change Benjamin's world in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. But first, I had to take care of some business. My first stop was Peterson's General Store, where old Frank Peterson was restocking shelves behind the counter. He looked up with his usual warm smile as I entered. "Eleanor, good to see you. How was your visit with that successful son of yours?" "Educational," I replied, approaching the counter. "Frank, I need to ask you something. Do you remember selling me a lottery ticket about a month ago? The big jackpot drawing?" Frank's weathered face creased into a grin. "Course I remember. Been selling you the same numbers every week, for years. Why, don't tell me you actually won something." "I won something," I said quietly. "Frank, I won the whole thing." The box of cereal he'd been holding tumbled from his hands, scattering across the floor. You mean the $347 million? Eleanor, are you serious?" "Dead serious. And Frank, you're going to be getting a lot of media attention soon, because I'm about to go public with the win. I wanted you to hear it from me, first." Frank sat down heavily on the stool behind his counter, staring at me like I'd announced I was from Mars. "Eleanor Blackwood? You're telling me you've been sitting on the biggest lottery win in state history for a month and never said a word?" I had my reasons, but those reasons just expired. I spent the next hour at Frank's store, partly because he needed time to process the news and partly because I needed mentally prepare for what came next. Frank was a good man, a pillar of our small community, and I knew the media circus would descend on his store as soon as the news broke. He deserved to be prepared. "What are you going to do with all that money?" he finally asked, still looking dazed. "I'm going to use it to teach someone a very important lesson about respect. And then I'm going to figure out what comes after that." My next stop was the Millbrook Community Center, where I'd been volunteering twice a week since retiring from nursing. The center served as a hub for senior services, providing everything from hot meals to transportation assistance for the elderly residents of our town. I found Martha Rodriguez, the center's director, in her cramped office surrounded by stacks of grant applications and budget spreadsheets. "Eleanor, you're early for your shift," Martha said, looking up from her paperwork with tired eyes. "Though honestly, I could use the help. We just found out the state is cutting our funding by 30% next year." "That's actually why I'm here," I said, closing her office door behind me. "Martha, what would it take to not only restore that funding, but expand your services? Maybe add a new wing, hire more staff, extend your hours?" Martha laughed, but there was no humor in it. "In my dreams, about $2 million. In reality, we'll be lucky if we can keep the doors open." I sat down across from her desk and pulled out my phone, opening my banking app. "Martha, I need you to look at something, and I need you to promise me you won't faint." I turned the phone screen toward her, showing my account balance. Martha's eyes widened, then widened more. Then she grabbed the phone to look closer. $347,892,156.78? Eleanor, what is this? Is this some kind of joke? It's not a joke. I won the lottery a month ago, the biggest jackpot in Colorado history, and I've been waiting for the right time to start putting that money to good use. Martha dropped the phone like it was on fire, then immediately picked it up again to stare at the numbers. Oh my God, Eleanor, you're rich. You're incredibly, impossibly rich. I am. And you know what I want to do with some of that money? I want to make sure places like this community center never have to worry about funding again. I want to expand services for seniors, create job opportunities for young people, maybe even build a new medical clinic. Martha started crying, not delicate tears, but full-body sobs that shook her small frame. Eleanor, I can't even... Do you understand what this means for our community? I'm beginning to. But Martha, this has to stay between us for now. I have some other business to take care of first, and then we'll make this official. Can you do that for me? She nodded vigorously, wiping her eyes with tissues for her desk. Of course. Eleanor, I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me. Just start making plans. Big plans. As I left the community center, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The power to make real, meaningful change in the world. Not just for myself, but for people who needed help, who deserved better, who had been forgotten by a system that only rewarded those who were already wealthy. But first, I had one more stop to make. The Millbrook Memorial Hospital was where I'd worked for most of my adult life, where I'd learned the value of caring for others, where I'd developed the work ethic and compassion that had shaped my entire worldview. The same values that my son had now decided were inconvenient obstacles to his success. I found Dr. Sarah Chen, David's daughter, though I doubted Benjamin knew the connection, in the hospital's administrative wing. Mrs. Blackwood! Sarah's face lit up when she saw me. What brings you back to our little corner of medical chaos? I wanted to talk to you about the hospital's financial situation, I said, settling into the chair across from her desk. I heard you've been struggling with equipment upgrades and staffing issues. Sarah's expression grew more serious. It's been challenging, yes. We're operating with technology that's 10 years old, and we can't compete with Denver hospitals when it comes to recruiting specialists. We're doing our best, but you need money. Significant money. About $5 million would transform this place completely. New MRI machine, updated surgical equipment, competitive salary packages to attract top talent. But that's fantasy money for a small-town hospital. I smiled, pulling out my phone again. Sarah, let me show you something that might change your perspective on fantasy money. 20 minutes later, Sarah was staring at me with the same shell-shocked expression Martha had worn, except she was also frantically scribbling notes on a pad. So you're telling me, she said, her voice slightly higher than normal, that you want to donate enough money to completely modernize our hospital, plus establish an endowment fund for ongoing operations? That's exactly what I'm telling you. This community supported me for 70 years. It's time I returned the favor. Mrs. Blackwood, Eleanor, this is beyond generous. It's transformational, life-changing for thousands of people. Good. That's what I want it to be. As I drove home to my small apartment, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. In 3 stops, I'd managed to secure the future of essential services for my entire community. The community center would expand its programs for seniors and provide job training for young people. The hospital would become a state-of-the-art medical facility capable of serving the entire region. All with money I'd won by pure chance. Money I'd been afraid to reveal because I thought it might complicate my relationship with my son.
My son, who had made it crystal clear that our relationship was already over unless I accepted a subservient role in his perfectly curated life.
By the time I reached my apartment, my phone was buzzing with texts from Margaret Hendricks. Phase 2 complete, press release drafted and ready for distribution. Are you sure you want to proceed? I looked around my modest one-bedroom apartment, at the secondhand furniture and discount store decorations, at the humble life I'd been living while sitting on one of the largest lottery jackpots in American history. Then I thought about Benjamin Blackwood, probably still on business calls, still discussing his empire expansion, still confident that his inconvenient mother had been successfully managed and contained. I typed back to Margaret, "Send the press release, all media outlets. I want this story everywhere by tonight." Then I made myself a cup of tea, sat down in my comfortable old recliner, and waited for the storm to begin. Because tomorrow, Benjamin Blackwood was going to wake up to a world where his supposedly poor, manageable mother was front-page news as one of the richest women in Colorado. And that was just the beginning of the lesson I was about to teach him about respect. Outside my apartment window, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It felt like the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of something entirely new. Something where Eleanor Blackwood would never again be invisible, ignored, or treated as anything less than the formidable woman she'd always been underneath. The phone started ringing at 8 p.m., reporters who'd received Margaret's press release and wanted interviews with Colorado's newest multi-millionaire. I let them all go to voicemail. I had more important things to do than talk to the media. I had a son to surprise. The media storm began at 6:47 a.m. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise over the Rockies, when my phone started buzzing like an angry wasp. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, all flooding in simultaneously as news outlets across Colorado picked up Margaret's press release. Mystery winner revealed. 70-year-old nurse wins $347 million jackpot. From retirement apartment to riches, Millbrook women's lottery secret. Colorado's biggest winner, local hero emerges with record jackpot. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was knocking on my door by 7:15, still in her bathrobe and slippers, holding her iPad with trembling hands. "Eleanor Blackwood, you tell me right now if what I'm reading on the internet is true. Channel 9 News is saying you won hundreds of millions of dollars." I invited her in and made fresh coffee while she scrolled through article after article, her eyes growing wider with each headline. $347 million, Eleanor. That's what they're saying. Please tell me this isn't some horrible mistake or identity theft situation. "It's not a mistake, Agnes," I said gently, sitting down across from her. "I won the lottery a month ago, the biggest lottery jackpot in Colorado history." Agnes stared at me for a full 30 seconds, then set down her iPad and laughed. Not a polite chuckle, but a deep belly laugh that shook her entire frame. "Eleanor Blackwood, you magnificent woman! You've been living in this apartment complex, clipping coupons and shopping clearance sales while sitting on more money than some small countries have in their treasuries?" I had my reasons for keeping it quiet. "Well, those reasons better be good because, honey, your quiet days are officially over. There are 3 news vans parked outside the apartment complex, and I saw helicopters circling when I walked over here." She was right. Through my kitchen window, I could see the media circus beginning to assemble. Reporters with microphones, cameramen setting up equipment, curious neighbors gathering in small groups to point at my apartment. My phone rang again. This time, it was my sister Dorothy calling from Phoenix. "Eleanor Marie, what in the Sam Hill is going on up there? I just got a call from my neighbor saying she saw your face on the morning news and they're calling you a multi-millionaire." "It's true, Dorothy. I won the lottery." The silence that followed lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dorothy, are you there?"
I'm here. I'm just trying to process the fact that my sister has been sitting on the story of the century while we'd been worrying about your finances and whether you had enough money for groceries. I wasn't ready to go public until now. What changed? I looked out the window at the growing media presence, thinking about Benjamin and his business call from this morning, probably discussing his expansion plans while completely unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. Someone reminded me that I've spent too many years making myself invisible to spare other people's comfort. I decided it was time to stop. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, you're not telling me. This doesn't sound like a happy lottery winner story. This sounds like you're angry about something. My sister had always been perceptive. Even over the phone, she could hear the steel underneath my calm exterior. We'll talk more later, Dorothy. Right now, I have some business to handle. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen and methodically went through the flood of messages that had accumulated on my phone. Reporters requesting interviews, financial advisors offering their services, distant relatives I hadn't heard from in decades suddenly wanting to reconnect. But nothing from Benjamin. Either he hadn't seen the news yet, or he was processing it in his own way. Knowing my son, he was probably calculating how this development affected his business prospects and social standing. The question was whether he'd see my lottery win as an asset or an embarrassment.
At 9 a.m., Margaret Hendricks called. "Eleanor, I hope you're prepared for what's happening. The story has been picked up by national news outlets. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, they're all running segments about Colorado's mystery lottery winner revealed. Your phone is probably ringing off the hook." It is, but Margaret, I need you to start Phase 3 now. Are you absolutely sure? Phase 3 is irreversible. Once we implement those arrangements, there's no going back. I'm sure. How long will it take? With the financial instruments already in place? About 48 hours for everything to be legally binding? Do it. Phase 3 was the nuclear option in my plan, the move that would ensure Benjamin understood exactly how much power his supposedly helpless mother actually wielded. But first, I needed to handle the immediate situation. I called Dr. Sarah Chen at the hospital. "Eleanor, my phone hasn't stopped ringing since 7 a.m. Reporters are calling the hospital asking about your connection to us, wanting to know if the donation rumors are true." "What have you told them?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to check with you first. But Eleanor, I have to ask, is it true? Are you really planning to donate millions to the hospital?" "It's true. $5 million to start, with an endowment fund that will generate ongoing support. Sarah, I want you to call a press conference for this afternoon, 2 p.m. at the hospital. I'm going to make the donation official." "Eleanor, the media attention will be enormous." "Good. That's exactly what I want." Next, I called Martha Rodriguez at the community center. "Eleanor, this is incredible. The phones have been ringing all morning. Everyone in town is talking about your lottery win, and people are asking if it's true that you're planning to help the community center." "It's true. $2 million for expansion and modernization, plus an operational fund." "Martha, I want you to coordinate with Sarah Chen at the hospital. We're doing a joint press conference at 2 p.m. to announce both donations." "Both donations? Eleanor, how much money are you planning to give away?" "As much as it takes to make a real difference in this community." "And Martha, I want you to invite everyone, the whole town. Make it an event." By 11 a.m., I was ready to leave my apartment for the first time since the news broke. The media crowd outside had grown to nearly 20 vehicles. News vans, newspaper reporters, even what looked like a documentary crew. I put on my best dress, a navy blue outfit I'd worn to Benjamin's wedding, and walked outside to face them. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Cameras clicked, microphones thrust toward my face, reporters shouting questions over each other. "Mrs. Blackwood, how does it feel to win the biggest lottery jackpot in Colorado history. What are your plans for the money? Is it true you've been keeping this secret for a month? Why did you decide to go public now?" I raised my hand for quiet, and surprisingly, the crowd settled down. "I'll answer a few questions, but I have an announcement to make first. This afternoon at 2 p.m., I'll be holding a press conference at Millbrook Memorial Hospital to discuss my plans for the lottery money. I encourage everyone to attend. Mrs. Blackwood, can you tell us why you kept the win secret for so long?" I looked directly into the nearest camera. "I kept it secret because I wanted to make sure I used this blessing responsibly. I wanted to think carefully about how to make the biggest positive impact on the people and community that have supported me throughout my life." "What kind of impact are you planning?" "The kind that changes lives. The kind that shows what's possible when someone with resources decides to invest in their community instead of just themselves." "Mrs. Blackwood, do you have any family? How have they reacted to your win?" The question hit exactly as I had hoped it would. I paused, looked thoughtful, then answered with careful precision. "I have a son, Benjamin Blackwood. He lives in Newport Beach, California, where he runs a successful technology company. As for his reaction, well, I suppose we'll find out, won't we?" The reporters sensed a story underneath the story. Questions flew faster. "Have you told your son about the lottery win? What was his reaction? Will he be involved in your philanthropic plans?" I smiled, the kind of smile that promised more information to come. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for this afternoon's announcement." As I walked back toward my apartment, I could hear the reporters already making phone calls, trying to track down information about Benjamin and his company. Within hours, they'd have his contact information, background details, probably even footage of his Newport Beach mansion. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Saw the news coverage. Masterfully handled. The press conference this afternoon will be wall-to-wall media coverage. Are you ready for this level of attention?" I texted back, "I've been invisible for 70 years. I think I can handle being visible for a while." But even as I typed those words, I felt a flutter of nervousness in my chest. This was really happening. By evening, my story would be national news. Benjamin's world of carefully managed business relationships and social climbing was about to be invaded by reporters asking uncomfortable questions about his lottery-winning mother. The same mother he'd told his investors was successfully managed and relegated to appropriate boundaries. At 1:30 p.m., I arrived at Millbrook Memorial Hospital to find the parking lot overflowing with vehicles. News trucks with satellite dishes, cars from neighboring towns, even a few buses that had brought curious spectators from as far as Denver. The hospital's main conference room had been transformed into a media center, with a podium, professional lighting, and rows of chairs packed with reporters, community members, and hospital staff. Dr. Sarah Chen introduced me with barely contained excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to introduce Eleanor Blackwood, longtime Millbrook resident, retired nurse, and Colorado's newest philanthropist." The applause was thunderous as I approached the podium. Looking out at the crowd, I saw faces I'd known for decades, mixed with reporters from major news outlets. Mrs. Patterson from next door was sitting in the front row, beaming with pride. Frank Peterson from the general store was there with his whole family. Martha Rodriguez had tears in her eyes. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 4 weeks ago, I won $347 million in the Colorado lottery. Today, I want to tell you what I plan to do with that blessing. I outlined the hospital donation, $5 million for equipment and facilities, plus a $10 million endowment for ongoing operations. The community center would receive $2 million for expansion and $3 million for programming. I announced plans for a scholarship fund for local students, a senior services enhancement program, and a small business development initiative. In total, I said, looking directly into the cameras, I'm committing $25 million to immediate community improvement projects with another $50 million in long-term endowments and funds. The room erupted in applause, but I held up my hand for silence. But I want to be clear about something. This isn't just about money. This is about values, about remembering where we come from and taking care of the people who helped us along the way. It's about understanding that true success isn't measured by what we accumulate, but by what we contribute. A reporter in the back raised her hand. Mrs. Blackwood, this level of giving is extraordinary for any lottery winner. What inspired such generous donations? I paused, thinking about Benjamin's dismissive comments about family obligations and his determination to move beyond people who anchored him to the past. I was raised to believe that we have obligations to each other, I said carefully. That success without community responsibility is just selfishness with better marketing. Some people seem to forget that lesson as they climb higher in the world. I don't want to be one of those people. Another reporter jumped in. What about your son? Will he be involved in your philanthropic efforts? The question I'd been waiting for. The moment when Benjamin's carefully managed business world would collide with his mother's very public moral stance. My son has built a successful technology company in California, I said, choosing my words with surgical precision. He's achieved remarkable things through hard work and determination. As for whether he'll be involved in my charitable work, I paused, letting the anticipation build. I think that will depend on whether he shares the values that guide these decisions. What do you mean by that, Mrs. Blackwood? I mean that money doesn't change who you are, it reveals who you are. Some people use success as an opportunity to help others rise with them. Others use it to distance themselves from their past, including the people who helped make their success possible. The reporters were scribbling frantically now, sensing the deeper story beneath my carefully diplomatic language. Mrs. Blackwood, it sounds like you're making a distinction between different approaches to success and wealth. I am. There are people who achieve success and remember where they came from, who honor the sacrifices that others made for their advancement, and then there are people who achieve success and decide that gratitude is a burden, that family obligations are obstacles to overcome rather than relationships to cherish. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on my words. Which category does your son fall into? A bold reporter asked. I looked directly into the main television camera, knowing that somewhere in California, Benjamin was probably watching this press conference or would see clips of it within an hour. I think my son will have to answer that question for himself, I said quietly. But I hope he remembers that the woman standing here today is the same woman who worked 2 jobs to put him through college, who mortgaged her home to help fund his dreams, who sacrificed her own comfort and retirement security to give him every opportunity to succeed. I paused, letting that sink in. And I hope he realizes that this lottery win doesn't change what I've always been. His mother, who loves him unconditionally, but who also expects to be treated with basic human dignity and respect. The press conference continued for another 30 minutes, but I knew the damage was done. By evening, news outlets across the country would be running stories about the lottery-winning mother who'd publicly challenged her successful son's values while committing unprecedented amounts to charity. Benjamin's phone was probably already ringing with reporters wanting his response to his mother's very public moral stance. As I left the hospital that afternoon, surrounded by well-wishers and community members thanking me for my generosity, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't being managed or dismissed or relegated to the margins of someone else's success story. I was Eleanor Blackwood, $347 million lottery winner and philanthropist, and I had something important to say about values, family, and what real success looked like. More importantly, I had the resources to make sure people listened. My phone had been buzzing throughout the press conference, but I'd ignored it. Now, walking to my car, I finally checked the messages. 17 missed calls from Benjamin, 12 voicemails, and one text message that made me smile. "Mom, we need to talk. Now." I typed back a simple response. "I'm sure we do. But first, you might want to watch the news. I think you'll find it educational." Then I drove home to prepare for phase 3 of my plan, knowing that the hardest part was yet to come. Because tomorrow, Benjamin was going to discover that underestimating his mother's power had consequences far beyond bad publicity. Tomorrow, he was going to learn what happened when you tried to manage Eleanor Blackwood. Benjamin called at 11:47 p.m. I was sitting in my living room, still in my navy dress from the press conference, watching CNN replay segments of my hospital announcement when my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen like an accusation. I let it ring 4 times before answering. "Hello, Benjamin." "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "I've had 17 reporters call me today. 17. My assistant had to disconnect our main office line because journalists keep calling asking for my reaction to your mother's lottery win and charitable statements. I imagine that must be inconvenient for you." "Inconvenient?" Benjamin's voice rose sharply. "Mom, I have investors calling me, asking if this affects Zenith's stability. I have business partners wondering if I'm going to be distracted by family drama. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put me in?" I settled back in my recliner, watching my son's face on the muted television screen as a local news station replayed footage from his company's website. He looked successful, confident, untouchable, exactly the image he'd worked so hard to cultivate. "What kind of position is that, Benjamin?" "You made me look like some kind of ungrateful son who abandons his elderly mother. That reporter from Channel 7 asked me directly if I'd been managing you like you suggested in your press conference. What was I supposed to say to that?" "You could try telling the truth." The silence that followed was so long, I thought the call had dropped. When Benjamin finally spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. "The truth? The truth is that you've just blown up my professional life because you're having some kind of emotional breakdown about boundaries and expectations. The truth is that you sat on this lottery win for a month, making decisions without consulting anyone, and now you're using it as a weapon to embarrass me publicly?" I looked at the television screen, where my press conference was being replayed with the headline, "Lottery Winner Questions Son's Values." My face filled the screen as I talked about sacrifices and gratitude and remembering where you came from. "Is that what you think this is about, Benjamin? Embarrassing you?" "What else could it be about? You specifically mentioned mortgaging your house for my education, working 2 jobs, sacrificing your retirement. You painted me as some kind of heartless son who forgot his poor mother. And then you commit to giving away $75 million without even discussing it with your family?" "My family?" "Yes, your family. Mom, that's generational wealth you're throwing away. That money could set up trust funds, could secure our family's future for decades. Instead, you're giving it to strangers because you want to make some kind of point about values." I felt something cold settle in my chest. Even now, even after everything, Benjamin's first concern wasn't our relationship or my happiness or whether I felt respected and valued. It was the money. It was what my lottery win could do for him.
Benjamin, let me ask you something. In all of this, in all your concern about investors and business partners and professional reputation, have you once asked me how I'm doing? Have you asked me why I kept the lottery win secret? Have you wondered if maybe I needed time to process winning more money than I'd ever dreamed of? Another silence. Shorter this time, but telling. Of course I care about how you're doing, Mom, but you can't just... When was the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not in relation to your business or your reputation, but just because I'm your mother and you care about my well-being. I could hear him breathing through the phone, and I knew he was calculating his response, trying to find the right words to regain control of the conversation. "This isn't fair," he said finally. "You're putting me in an impossible position. If I support your charity work, it looks like I only care about the money. If I question it, I look like the ungrateful son you painted me as in that press conference."
I didn't paint you as anything, Benjamin. I talked about values and priorities. If you see yourself in that description, maybe that's something you need to examine. God, Mom, listen to yourself. You're being manipulative and you don't even see it. You're using guilt and public pressure to force me into some kind of emotional performance that has nothing to do with reality. The word manipulative hit me like a physical blow. After everything, after years of sacrifice, after being dismissed and relegated to the margins of his life, after being told I needed to be helpful and invisible around his business associates, he was calling me manipulative for finally standing up for myself. Benjamin, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Yesterday morning, you gave me an ultimatum. You told me that if I wanted to maintain a relationship with you, I needed to accept clear boundaries about my behavior and conduct. You told me I needed to be helpful and invisible around your business associates. You made it clear that my role in your life was to serve and support without expecting recognition or respect. I paused, letting that sink in. You turned our mother-son relationship into an employment negotiation, with you as the employer setting the terms for my continued presence in your life. So I decided to explore my options. Your options? What is that supposed to mean? I smiled, thinking about the legal documents Margaret had been preparing all day, the arrangements that would be finalized within 24 hours. It means I'm not the same person you dismissed yesterday morning, Benjamin. It means the game has changed, and you don't get to set all the rules anymore. Mom, what are you talking about? What game? Through my apartment window, I could see news vans still parked in the complex parking lot, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky like mechanical flowers reaching for sun. Tomorrow's news cycle would bring fresh coverage of my story, more questions about Benjamin's response, more scrutiny of our family dynamics. I'm talking about respect, Benjamin. I'm talking about the fact that for the first time in years, I have real power in this relationship. Not just money, although that's part of it, but the power that comes from not needing anything from you anymore. You're threatening me. I'm informing you. There's a difference. Benjamin's voice dropped to the tone he probably used in business negotiations when he sensed weakness in his opponents. Mom, let's be practical here. You're 70 years old, you've never managed significant wealth before, and you're making emotional decisions based on hurt feelings. You need guidance. You need family support. You need people who care about your long-term well-being, not just journalists looking for a feel-good story. The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. Even now, even when I held more financial power than he'd ever dreamed of, he was still trying to manage me, still treating me like a confused elderly woman who needed his superior judgment to guide her decisions. What I need, I said quietly, is for my son to treat me like a human being instead of a problem to be solved.
What I need is for him to show some gratitude for the sacrifices that made his success possible. What I need is for him to demonstrate that his values include something beyond profit margins and business networking. This is emotional blackmail. No, Benjamin. Emotional blackmail would be threatening to hurt myself if you don't comply with my wishes. What I'm doing is setting my own boundaries. I'm telling you that I refuse to accept a relationship where I am treated as subordinate, where my worth is measured by my usefulness to your career, where my presence is only welcomed if I remain invisible and compliant. I could hear him breathing heavily through the phone, and I knew his business mind was racing, trying to find an angle that would give him control of the situation. What do you want from me, Mom? Specifically, what would satisfy you? The question revealed everything about how Benjamin saw relationships. As transactions to be negotiated, problems to be solved with the right combination of words and gestures. I want you to understand that your mother isn't a business problem or a reputation risk or a family complication that needs to be managed. I want you to recognize that the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for your success, deserves better than being told she needs to be helpful and invisible in order to maintain access to your life. Fine, I shouldn't have said that. I was stressed about the investor dinner, and I spoke harshly. Is that what you need to hear? Even his apology was strategic, calculated to end the conversation rather than address the underlying issue. Benjamin, do you know what I did today after the press conference? Apparently you committed to giving away most of your lottery winnings to charity. I did something else too. I called my lawyer and made some arrangements. Legal arrangements that will become binding tomorrow morning. I could practically hear his mental gears shifting as he processed this information. What kind of arrangements? The kind that ensure I'll never again be in a position where I need to depend on anyone else's charity or tolerance. The kind that make it clear that Eleanor Blackwood is nobody's burden or obligation. Mom, what did you do?
Margaret had worked until nearly midnight preparing the documents. Trust structures, investment arrangements, legal frameworks that would demonstrate exactly how much power a $347 million lottery winner could wield when she decided to stop being accommodating. Tomorrow, Benjamin, you're going to discover that your lottery-winning mother has some very interesting ideas about family responsibility and accountability. Ideas that go both ways.
That sounds like a threat.
It's a promise, the same way your ultimatum yesterday morning was a promise. You promised me that I could be helpful and invisible, or I could be gradually erased from your life. Well, I'm making you a promise in return. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment, and I could tell he was trying to calculate the risks and opportunities in this new dynamic. His business mind was probably weighing the potential benefits of having a multimillionaire mother against the complications of having that mother publicly question his values and character. What's your promise, Mom? I looked at the television screen, where late-night news was running another segment about Colorado's philanthropic lottery winner. The screen showed footage of the hospital, the community center, interviews with residents talking about the transformative impact my donations would have on their lives. My promise is this. You'll never again have to worry about managing my expectations or setting boundaries for my behavior. You'll never again have to explain to your business associates why your elderly mother needs accommodation or consideration. You'll never again have to balance your professional obligations against family complications. That actually sounds reasonable. I'm not finished. My promise also includes this. You'll discover what it means to be held accountable for your choices. You'll learn what it feels like to have someone with real power examine your character and find it lacking. You'll understand what it's like to have your professional relationships and social standing depend on someone else's evaluation of your worthiness. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses.
This wasn't Benjamin calculating his response. This was Benjamin beginning to understand that he was no longer controlling the conversation. Mom, I think we should meet in person to discuss this. These kinds of conversations shouldn't happen over the phone. You're right. We should meet in person. In fact, I insist on it. Good. I can fly up to Colorado tomorrow. We can have lunch, work through whatever misunderstandings have developed, find a way forward that works for both of us. I almost laughed at his assumption that he could schedule our confrontation, manage the location and timing to his advantage, turn our reckoning into a business meeting he could control. Actually, Benjamin, I think you misunderstood. I'm not inviting you to Colorado. I'm coming to California, to your house. And I'm not coming alone. What does that mean? It means that tomorrow evening, you're going to have some very interesting dinner guests. People who are eager to meet the successful son of Colorado's newest philanthropist. People who are curious about your thoughts on family values and social responsibility. I could hear the panic starting to creep into his voice. Mom, what are you talking about? What dinner guests? The same people who were at your house 2 nights ago, Benjamin. Victoria Sterling, David Chen, and Alexandra Petrov. Along with a few additional guests who I think will find our family dynamics very educational. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Margaret has already extended the invitations on my behalf. Everyone accepted with enthusiasm. Apparently, there's quite a bit of curiosity about meeting the lottery winner who's been making such generous charitable commitments. They're particularly interested in hearing more about family values and the importance of honoring the people who contribute to our success. Mom, you cannot show up at my house with my investors and turn this into some kind of public confrontation. I'm not creating a confrontation, Benjamin. I'm creating an opportunity. An opportunity for you to demonstrate the values you claim to hold. An opportunity for your business associates to see how you treat the people who helped make your success possible. An opportunity for everyone to witness what respect and gratitude look like in action. This is insane. You're trying to destroy my business relationships over some hurt feelings about a dinner conversation. I'm trying to discover whether my son is capable of treating his mother with basic human dignity when he can't control the circumstances or manage the audience. Through the phone, I could hear what sounded like Benjamin pacing, probably in that pristine living room with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Pacific. What do you want, Mom? Really, specifically, what do you want me to do? I want you to be yourself, Benjamin. Completely, authentically yourself. I want your investors to see exactly who you are when you think nobody important is watching. I want them to witness how you handle family relationships when those relationships can't be managed through boundaries and ultimatums. And if I refuse to participate in this dinner, I smiled, thinking about the additional arrangements Margaret had finalized that afternoon, the ones Benjamin didn't know about yet, the ones that would ensure he understood exactly how much his lottery-winning mother could impact his carefully constructed world.
Then you'll discover that refusing isn't really an option anymore. You'll learn that when someone has significant resources and unlimited time, they can make their displeasure known in very creative and persistent ways. You're blackmailing me. I'm presenting you with a choice, the same way you presented me with a choice yesterday morning. You can embrace this opportunity to demonstrate your character, or you can face the consequences of disappointing someone who has the means to make those consequences memorable. Benjamin was quiet for nearly a minute. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. The anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something that sounded almost like fear. When? Tomorrow evening, 7 o'clock, the same time as your investor dinner 2 nights ago. I thought the symmetry would be appropriate. Fine. But Mom, I want you to understand something. After tomorrow night, after this, whatever this is that you're orchestrating, things between us are going to be different. Permanently different. Yes, Benjamin, they are. That's exactly the point. After I hung up, I sat in my quiet apartment for a long time, watching the late-night news cycle continue to cover my story. Interviews with community members talking about my generosity, analysis from financial experts discussing the unprecedented nature of my charitable commitments, commentary from social observers about family dynamics and intergenerational relationships. Tomorrow night, all of that coverage would seem like a warm-up act. Tomorrow night, Benjamin Blackwood was going to discover that his mother's transformation from invisible servant to public figure was only the beginning of her evolution. Tomorrow night, he was going to learn what happened when someone who had spent 70 years being accommodating decided to stop. The flight from Denver to Los Angeles gave me 3 hours to review Margaret's final documents and prepare for the evening that would change everything. Seated in first class, a luxury I could now afford without thinking twice, I studied the legal papers that would deliver my ultimate lesson to Benjamin. Margaret sat across the aisle, her briefcase full of contracts, trust documents, and one particularly devastating surprise that Benjamin wouldn't see coming until it was too late. "Eleanor, are you absolutely certain about this?" she asked as we began our descent into LAX. "Once we execute these arrangements tonight, there's no taking them back. Your son's life is going to change permanently." I looked out the airplane window at the sprawling city below, somewhere in which Benjamin was probably preparing for the most important and most challenging dinner of his life. He made his choices, Margaret. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The limousine I had hired at the airport was waiting, another small luxury that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. As we drove through LA traffic toward Newport Beach, Margaret briefed me on the final details of our strategy. The investors all confirmed they'll be there by 7. I've also arranged for 2 additional guests you requested. The documentary crew from CNN who's been covering your story, and Janet Morrison from the Los Angeles Times. They'll be discreet but present. And the other arrangements? All finalized. The trust transfers, the business acquisitions, the legal notifications, everything will be implemented simultaneously at 8 o'clock tonight, exactly 1 hour into dinner. Benjamin won't know what hit him. At 6:30 p.m., our limousine pulled up to Benjamin's glass mansion overlooking the Pacific. The house looked exactly as I remembered from 2 nights ago, pristine, expensive, and cold as a museum display. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see Benjamin pacing in his living room, probably rehearsing how he planned to manage the evening. He had no idea what was coming. Victoria Sterling's Mercedes was already in the driveway, along with David Chen's Tesla and Alexandra Petrov's Bentley. My son's potential investors had arrived early, probably eager to meet the lottery-winning philanthropist who'd been making headlines across the country. Benjamin opened the front door before I could knock, his expression a carefully controlled mask of professional courtesy. He was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, his hair perfectly styled, his smile practiced and hollow. "Mom, you look lovely. Please, come in." Behind me, Margaret emerged from the limousine with her briefcase, followed by the CNN crew and the Times reporter. Benjamin's practiced smile flickered as he realized I hadn't come alone. "I hope you don't mind," I said sweetly, "but there's been so much interest in our family story that I thought it would be wonderful to have some documentation of our reunion. Margaret is my attorney, and these lovely people are here to capture what I'm sure will be a very memorable evening." Benjamin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he stepped aside to let us enter. "Of course, always happy to accommodate the media." "Everyone," Benjamin announced with forced enthusiasm, "I'd like you to meet my mother, Eleanor Blackwood, Colorado's newest philanthropist and lottery winner." The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Victoria stood first, extending her hand with the kind of warm smile reserved for people worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "Mrs. Blackwood, what an absolute pleasure to meet you. We've been following your story with such admiration. The charitable commitments you've made are truly extraordinary." David Chen joined in, his earlier cool professionalism replaced by obvious interest. "Mrs. Blackwood, as someone who works with successful entrepreneurs daily, I have to say your approach to sudden wealth is remarkably mature and socially conscious. Most lottery winners make much less thoughtful decisions. Alexandra Petrov approached with the calculating grace of a woman who'd built her fortune on reading people accurately. Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? Your press conference yesterday was absolutely inspiring. The way you spoke about values and community responsibility, it was exactly the kind of leadership our society needs more of. I accepted their praise graciously while watching Benjamin out of the corner of my eye. His expression remained professionally pleasant, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was beginning to understand that this evening might not go according to his plans. "Thank you all so much," I replied warmly, "but I have to say I'm much more interested in hearing about your work with Benjamin. He's told me so much about Zenith Technologies and the incredible growth you're helping to fund." "Your son has built something truly impressive," Victoria said, settling back onto the couch. "The artificial intelligence applications in his smart home systems are genuinely revolutionary. We're looking at potentially transformative market penetration." "That's wonderful to hear," I said, taking a seat in the chair that commanded the best view of the room. "Benjamin has always been brilliant with technology. Even as a child, he had an intuitive understanding of how systems work, how to optimize efficiency and eliminate unnecessary complications." The CNN camera was rolling discreetly from the corner, capturing every word, every expression, every subtle shift in the room's dynamics. Benjamin moved to the bar cart, his movements slightly stiff. "Can I offer anyone a drink? Mom, your usual?" It was a small test. Did he remember what his mother drank? Had he paid attention to such details during our years together? "I'll have a scotch. Neat. Macallan 25, if you have it." Benjamin's pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. He didn't know what his mother's usual drink was because he'd never bothered to notice such personal details. "Of course," he said, pouring an expensive whiskey that would cost more than many people's grocery budget. As he handed me the glass, David Chen leaned forward with obvious interest. "Eleanor, we were just discussing with Benjamin the importance of family support in entrepreneurial success. Your contributions to his early development must have been significant." I took a sip of the scotch, which was indeed excellent, and smiled at the opening he'd provided. "Oh, they were significant. I worked 2 jobs for most of Benjamin's childhood after his father left us. Double shifts at the hospital, weekend catering jobs, taking in sewing, whatever it took to keep us afloat and save for his education." Benjamin's expression didn't change, but I could see him calculating, trying to figure out where this conversation was heading. "That level of sacrifice is remarkable," Alexandra observed. "It must be incredibly satisfying to see your son achieve such success after all your hard work." "It is," I said carefully, "though I have to admit success changes people, sometimes in ways you don't expect." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "How so?" I glanced at Benjamin, who was standing by the bar cart, his drink untouched, watching me like a man waiting for a bomb to explode. "Well, for instance, when Benjamin was young, family meant everything to him. He understood that we were a team, that we supported each other through difficulties, that gratitude and respect were the foundations of strong relationships." The room was completely silent, except for the subtle whir of the CNN camera. "And now?" David asked. "Now he's developed more sophisticated ideas about family dynamics, more strategic approaches to managing relationships." Benjamin's voice cut through the tension. "Mom, perhaps we should move to dinner. I'm sure our guests are hungry." But Victoria was clearly intrigued by the conversation. "Strategic approaches? What do you mean by that, Eleanor?" I set down my scotch and looked directly at my son. "Benjamin, would you like to explain to your investors how you handle family management? I believe you have some very definite philosophies about boundaries and appropriate expectations." The silence that followed was electric. Everyone in the room could sense the undercurrent of tension, the careful dance of words that carry deeper meanings. "I think," Benjamin said carefully, "that successful entrepreneurs need to maintain clear priorities.
Family is important, but it can't interfere with professional obligations. Interfere, I repeated, thoughtfully. That's such an interesting word choice. Tell me, Benjamin, in what ways might family interfere with professional success?
Margaret caught my eye from across the room and tapped her watch. It was 7:45. 15 minutes until the legal arrangements would be implemented. 15 minutes until Benjamin's world changed forever. For instance, Benjamin continued, clearly sensing he was in dangerous territory but unable to stop himself, elderly family members sometimes develop unrealistic expectations about ongoing support or involvement in business decisions. Clear boundaries help everyone understand their appropriate roles. Appropriate roles? Victoria murmured, her expression growing more thoughtful. Can you give us a specific example of what that looks like? Benjamin glanced at me, probably hoping I'd change the subject or deflect the question. Instead, I smiled encouragingly. Go ahead, sweetheart. Tell them about the appropriate role you envision for me in your life. The trap was closing, and Benjamin was walking right into it. Well, for example, when entertaining business associates, it's important that family members understand how to be helpful without creating disruptions or uncomfortable situations. Helpful how? Alexandra asked, with obvious curiosity. Benjamin's professional mask was starting to slip. Just supportive, accommodating, understanding that business relationships require a certain level of professionalism that doesn't always include personal family dynamics. David Chen leaned back in his chair, studying Benjamin with the analytical gaze of someone who evaluated character for a living. That's an interesting perspective. How does your mother feel about these boundaries? All eyes turned to me. The CNN camera adjusted slightly to capture my response. Margaret opened her briefcase and began removing documents. I think, I said slowly, that Benjamin's approach to family management has been very educational for me, very revealing about his values and priorities. In what way? Victoria asked. I stood up, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased Benjamin's expensive view of the Pacific Ocean. Behind me, I could hear the subtle sound of Margaret arranging papers on the coffee table. 2 nights ago, I came to this house to cook dinner for these same investors. I spent 6 hours preparing an elaborate meal while Benjamin entertained you all with discussions about his business success and growth projections. I turned back to face the room, noting that everyone was hanging on my words. During that dinner, Benjamin explained to you how he'd successfully managed family complications that could have interfered with his entrepreneurial focus. He described how he'd set clear boundaries with his elderly mother, how he'd taught me to understand my appropriate role in supporting his success without becoming a burden. Benjamin's face had gone pale. Mom, I don't think this is... He told you that the elderly mother he was discussing had mortgaged her home to help fund his education, had cashed in her retirement savings to provide his startup capital, had worked double shifts for years to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed. The room was absolutely silent. Victoria, David Chen, and Alexandra were staring at Benjamin with expressions that ranged from surprise to obvious discomfort. But what Benjamin didn't mention, I continued, my voice growing stronger, the elderly mother he was discussing had just won $347 million in the Colorado lottery and had been sitting on that information for weeks while deciding how to handle the blessing responsibly. The explosion of reactions was immediate. Victoria's eyes widened in shock. David Chen sat forward abruptly. Alexandra Petrova actually gasped. Benjamin looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. But here's what Benjamin really didn't anticipate. He didn't consider that a mother with unlimited resources and unlimited time might decide that respect is more important than family peace.
that accountability might be more valuable than maintaining comfortable illusions. "Mom, what are you doing?" Benjamin's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm teaching you about consequences, sweetheart, the same way you taught me about appropriate boundaries." I handed the first document to Victoria Sterling. "This is a formal acquisition offer for a controlling interest in Zenith Technologies. $1 billion cash, with a provision that all current management contracts can be terminated at the discretion of the new ownership." Victoria's hands trembled as she scanned the legal language. "Eleanor, this is a hostile takeover document." "Not hostile, educational. Benjamin needs to learn what it feels like to have his professional future depend on someone else's evaluation of his character." I handed the second document to David Chen. "This is a formal complaint to the Better Business Bureau and the California Attorney General's office regarding potential elder abuse and financial manipulation. Completely fictional, of course, but it will require investigation and could impact Benjamin's business relations for months." David stared at the document like it might catch fire in his hands. The third document went to Alexandra Petrova. "And this is a detailed financial analysis showing how Benjamin's company could be improved under new management. Management that prioritizes community responsibility and family values alongside profit margins." Alexandra read quickly, her business mind clearly processing the implications. "Eleanor, these arrangements would give you complete control over Benjamin's company and professional reputation. Exactly the same control he assumed he had over our family relationship," I replied. "The same power to set boundaries, establish appropriate roles, and eliminate complications that interfered with my priorities." Benjamin was standing frozen by the bar cart, his untouched drink still in his hand, staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Of course," I continued, "I'm not actually going to implement any of these arrangements. Just like Benjamin, I believe in giving people choices about how they want to conduct their relationships." I walked over to my son, close enough that only he could hear my next words. "You can apologize, Benjamin, publicly, genuinely, and completely. You can acknowledge that your mother deserves respect and gratitude instead of management and boundaries. You can admit to your investors that you were wrong about family values and priorities." I paused, letting him process the alternatives. "Or you can wake up tomorrow morning to discover that your lottery-winning mother has decided to become a very involved, very hands-on investor in your company. Your choice." The room waited in absolute silence. The CNN camera captured every moment of Benjamin's internal struggle, the calculations playing across his face as he weighed his pride against his survival instincts. Finally, slowly, Benjamin set down his untouched drink and walked to the center of the room. "I owe everyone here an apology, especially my mother. 2 nights ago, I treated her like hired help instead of the woman who sacrificed everything to make my success possible. I was embarrassed by our modest background and tried to hide the sacrifices she made for my benefit." He looked directly at me, and for the first time in years, I saw something genuine in his expression. "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for taking you for granted, for treating you like a burden instead of a blessing, for forgetting that everything I've achieved was built on your foundation of love and sacrifice. You deserved better from me, and I failed you completely." Victoria Sterling was the first to break the silence. "Eleanor, your son is very lucky to have a mother who cares enough to teach him such an important lesson." "Indeed," David Chen added, "family relationships that can survive this level of honest confrontation are rare and valuable. Benjamin, you should treasure what you have with your mother." Alexandra Petrov nodded approvingly. "This kind of accountability is exactly what we look for in business leaders, the ability to acknowledge mistakes, learn from them, and grow." Margaret gathered the unused legal documents and returned them to her briefcase. I think our work here is done, she said with satisfaction. As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, Benjamin approached me on the deck overlooking the ocean. Mom, I need to ask you something. Would you really have gone through with those takeover documents? I looked out at the Pacific, dark and endless under the night sky. What do you think, Benjamin? He was quiet for a long moment. I think my mother is a lot more formidable than I ever gave her credit for. Your mother is exactly the same person she's always been. The only thing that changed was her willingness to accept disrespect. Benjamin nodded slowly. What happens now? With us, I mean. Now you get to decide what kind of son you want to be to a mother who happens to have $347 million and unlimited time to spend it on causes she believes in. And if I choose to be the kind of son who treats his mother with love and respect, then you get to help me figure out how to use this blessing to make the world a little bit better, together. 6 months later, the Blackwood Family Foundation had become one of the most respected charitable organizations in the country. Benjamin had taken a leave of absence from Zenith Technologies to serve as the foundation's Director of Technology Initiatives, focusing on projects that brought smart home innovations to underserved communities. We had dinner together every Sunday, not in his sterile mansion, but in the comfortable family room of the house I'd purchased in a neighborhood where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. The toilet in my guest bathroom remained perfectly clean, maintained by a professional housekeeping service that Benjamin insisted on paying for, not because I needed the help, but because he wanted to demonstrate that his mother would never again be expected to clean up after other people's messes. And sometimes, when we were planning the foundation's next project or discussing how to make the biggest impact with our resources, I would catch Benjamin looking at me with something that had been missing from his eyes for too long. Respect, gratitude, and maybe finally understanding that the woman who'd raised him was exactly as formidable as she'd always been. She'd just been kind enough to let him forget it, until the day she decided to remind him.